Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar, How Personal Experiences Shape Corporate Inclusion. I'm Lisa Wood, Chief Marketing Officer for Virtual Z Computing. A couple of housekeeping details. Attendees will be muted during today's conversation. However, if you do have a question, we'd love for you to submit it via the Q&A at the bottom of your window, and we'll try our best to get to those at the end of our session. This is our first webinar of 2021 in the Making Our Strong Community Stronger collaborative initiative to accelerate diversity, equity, and inclusion. The collaboration is inspired by a question to mainframe leaders about diversity: what are you doing about it? We kicked off this initiative with our 2020 webinar, Mainframe Executives Are Investing in Diversity and Inclusion, and today we're continuing the conversation featuring the diverse personal stories of colleagues in the mainframe community, revealing how we each influence company culture. One collective takeaway that we can share today, may I suggest, is this: that challenging the biases we see in each other is the first step to real inclusivity, unlocking the potential of people and therefore our teams and companies. We are thrilled for you to meet our special guest today, and to get us started, I'd like to turn this over now to Dr. Gloria Chance. Dr. Chance?
Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to our second panel on how personal experiences shape corporate inclusion. And today, as Lisa mentioned, we are continuing the conversation, revealing how each of us influence our company culture. Hello, again, I'm Dr. Gloria Chance, your moderator. I'm a psychologist and founder and CEO of the Mousai Group. And I think we'll all agree that we're in an intense state of transition and change today, not just from a global, from a country, organizational perspective, but also a personal and individual perspective. And I think you will agree that we all realize that this diversity, equity, and inclusion journey, it's not a light switch that we can turn off and on. It's an actual journey. And our sponsor companies today, Rocket Software, IBM, Broadcom, Mainframe, the Broadcom mainframe software team, Virtual Z, Tech Channel, and the Open Mainframe Project are each on their individual company journeys and honoring the fact, just like we're here today, on the panel representing it, that it's not where you start, but that you start this dialogue and the journey wherever you are. And so this panel today is produced to help leaders and others understand how lived experiences influence culture. And I believe that the panelists and the sponsors stand with me in this middle space to create empathy, learning, hope, and regeneration in how we think about and behave on this topic of inclusivity. What does being included mean? It means that individuals feel that they belong, that they're involved, integrated, incorporated, embraced, and taken in by the company and organizations that they support. A May 2020 report from McKinsey Company found that while overall employee sentiment on corporate diversity was 52% positive and 31% negative, the sentiment on inclusion was markedly worse at 29% positive and 61% negative. And what does this mean? This means that while companies are on the journey of getting diverse representation into their organizations, it's not going to work if people do not feel included. If you do not feel included, then you will leave the organization. And why? Because culture is built by people. Culture is a way of life for groups of people. It's the way we do things. And it's an integrated pattern of knowledge, belief, our outlooks, our attitudes, values, goals, and customs that we share. And unfortunately, for some of us, we're not a part of that sharing. And so we know in psychology that behavior and thinking drives climate. So where do our attitudes and behavior come from? Many people don't know that they come from our personal mythology. And personal mythologies are stories that we tell ourselves when we're growing up to make sense and meaning in the world. It's the story that we live out through our human experience, and we get our messaging from our parents and our grandparents and the societies that we grew up in as children. And it becomes our mindset that drives our decisions, our thinking, and our behavior within organizations. And most of the time, you know, one of our panelists said, I think it was Ashley, she said so greatly in her story card. She said, you know, this year there has been less separation from work and family life than ever before. And the reality, everyone, is that there's never been a separation, because how do we bring part of us to work and leave the other part at home? And that's why in a lot of ways we're inauthentic, and we're also unconscious about the ways that we're treating people and we're making people become included. And so today, our panelists, they've done their work. They've gone on a journey with me to understand their unconscious bias and their personal mythology, to understand how their personal lived experiences have created who they are at work in their organizations, and how that impacts whether or not they feel included, excluded, and how they can make a difference in their organizations by focusing more on inclusion. So let's get started by meeting our esteemed panelists. And why don't we go ahead and I want to acknowledge that these panelists are very brave, and I want to commend them for sharing their stories, because I have to ask the audience, which one of you would sit here today and really bear your personal story for the benefit of others? And so I just want to acknowledge and thank the panelists for being authentic today by helping us create community, empathy, and togetherness through their personal stories. And so Sharra, why don't we begin with you?
Sure, thank you, Dr. Chance. It's so great to be here today to talk about this important topic. My name is Sharra Owens-Schwartz, and I am the Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity Senior Director at Rocket Software.
Thank you, Sharra. Jerry.
Hi, I am Jerry Chuaypradit. I manage a team of developers who support ZOS networking, ISPF, and some of our resiliency solutions on IBM Z, and I work for IBM.
Hey, and that's Jeff Henry. I'm the VP of Strategy, Product Management, and Design at the Broadcom Mainframe Software Division.
And my name is Ashley Peterson. I work at IBM as a product marketer on our Z and LinuxONE products.
Thank you, Sharra, Jerry, Jeff, and Ashley. And so now let's begin our storytelling by sharing some of the basics. So we already established that personal myths are stories that we tell ourselves to make sense of the world, and they're formed early in our childhood and from our experiences and what's happening in society at the time. So these are the stories that begin to create our mindset. So let's start with you, Jeff. Tell us a little bit about your early background and how you grew up.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to grow up in the Northern Virginia area, at least from like 8th grade on. And before that, I had moved from Western Maryland, and Northern Virginia is much more diverse, more transient. I mean, just in our cul-de-sac, it's a Black family up the street, a couple of Jewish families, a Hispanic family, an Asian family around the corner, transplants from Philly, from the Midwest, just a real mix of backgrounds. In fact, our probably highlight was when the all-pro safety for the Washington football team moved in and was the last person on my paper route. So I got to meet all of them personally, and it just opened up my mind and more of my curiosity to diverse thought.
That's pretty cool. Ashley, your background, though, contrasts with Jeff's. How so?
Yeah, so I actually grew up in Michigan in the Midwest until I was about 10, and then moved to Northern Illinois. And then my family moved to the South, to North Carolina, where I'm based today. So my perspective being from kind of the rural Midwest and then suburban South, I just had not a lot of exposure to diversity and inclusion. It wasn't something that I really thought about or had exposure to. So I didn't really influence that or have any opinion on it until I went to college and met more people who had different perspectives than me.
Thank you for that, Ashley. And Jerry, from the Midwest experience of Ashley and the Southern of Jeff and some of Ashley, you're from New York City. So share your upbringing and background.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, let me take you on a journey to the Northeast. I'm very proud of my roots. I was born in the Bronx, New York, I spent a good part of my childhood there, and my family moved us to a town just north of the Bronx called Yonkers, New York, when I was 13. And I'm proud of where I'm from because I was able to grow up in essentially what is the melting pot of America. But yet, like most immigrant families, my parents wanted to be around folks who looked like them, who spoke like them, who sounded like them. So I grew up in a relatively insular community. But being in that part of New York, my parents could only shelter me for so long. And as you can imagine, I had friends, neighbors from all walks of life, different backgrounds, different races. It was a very formative upbringing for me, and I'm thankful for it.
Oh, thank you for that, Jerry. And I'm from Brooklyn, and I don't know if you know this, but Yonkers, the people in Brooklyn don't really consider that like New York per se, but I'm
Yeah,
just
that's
saying.
yeah. A lot of people said like, "Why are you moving upstate?" And it's like upstate. I'm
Exactly.
moving to the next town up.
Exactly. And finally, thank you for that, Jerry. Finally, Sharra, share your background, please.
Yes, I also grew up in the Northeast, except I grew up in Boston. And in contrast, if anyone knows the Boston area, they know that the communities in Boston are really segregated, and they continue to be to today, with the exception of gentrification that's happening now. Growing up, there were places in the city where I just was not welcome. I grew up in a political family with a strong orientation toward justice, inclusion, equity, and I understood how important representation was. My parents made sure that I was equipped with the tools to navigate as a Black girl who would then grow up to be a Black woman. That meant that conversations about race, racism, and all the other inequities were staples in my family. And I not only had a strong family that supported me and gave me what I needed, I was also loved and guided by extended family and community where I lived, which was predominantly Black. I expected to be corrected by my friend's mama down the street. And I felt as if people believed in me and wanted the best for me. And in my village of my family, where I lived, my extended family, I felt a real sense of safety.
Sure, and that's a really interesting perspective. And I think all of the panelists, thank you for sharing very different backgrounds, some similarities, some differences. And part of this journey that we all went on together and individually, it also, sort of called out the fact that most people don't fit the stereotypes that people have in their minds about people. So when we look at some experiences that you've had, Jeff, growing up, can you share a little bit about some of the unconscious bias and things that you experienced growing up? You described being isolated, somewhat based
Sure.
on the fact that you were in a pretty diverse environment.
Sure, happy to. So, I mean, even in the diverse environment I grew up in, I was once chased in high school simply by a bunch of white kids just because I had a Black friend. And to me, this was very odd. I was surrounded by different backgrounds. Folks brought a different way of thinking that made me expand my thoughts. And I wanted to surround myself with that, to submerge myself into that learning, expand my thinking. And for example, I would go to different concerts, certainly different than what my parents grew up listening to. I would go and then be invited to family gatherings or picnics, church picnics, where I was one of a handful at most of white people. And I remember, I would be teased, maybe bullied a little bit, at least at some of the concerts. But I remember thinking, wow, this must be what it feels like. The difference being, I was there for entertainment. I was there for a couple of hours of my life. I had to step back and think about it, that this is the way that some of you feel all of your lives. This is what you feel like in the education environment that you go to get an education, where you go to get a job. It was really humbling to me to really step back and think about it from a different perspective.
Thank you for that, Jeff. So you had a choice. So you're saying that in your isolation feeling or your isolated feeling that you had a choice. You could step in and step out of that environment as you wanted to. But Shar, you had a similar experience of isolation, but it wasn't, you didn't really get to choose. Can you share more about your experience?
Yes, absolutely. So my parents did a brilliant job of preparing me for what to expect in interpersonal interactions and engaging with systems and institutions. Yet all of that preparation didn't prepare me for what I experienced in high school. I was in a classroom with a group of white kids. There was one Asian girl. They began using very derogatory language when they were referring to the Black kids in school. I was absolutely incredulous. I spoke up and I said to them, I said, you all realize that I'm sitting right here and you also realize that I'm Black, right? And so one boy responded by saying, oh no, Shara, you're not like them, you're different. And what he did not realize is that that was not a compliment. I was in shock and just so hurt by this experience because these were people that I regarded as friends. And for an instance, I met eyes with the Asian girl and she quickly diverted. And I understood in that moment that she understood just how horrible this was. And at the same time, I knew that she struggled herself to find her footing as a teenager, as being an other, right, in a predominantly white space. And in that time, during that time, I felt invisible, as if they'd erased me while I was right there in the room.
Mm-hmm. Wow, being erased while you're in the room is pretty profound. And thinking from, the beginning of that story that you were included and being erased in the moment and trying to get your footing is something that I think many, as you shared with the Asian woman, about the Asian woman, that we all at some point feel and share. Jeff, Shara's comments reminds me of your story, or an important part of your story when you started shifting your mindset, because oftentimes the people in the majority say when they're colorblind, that is actually another way of erasing us and making people of color become invisible. You had a moment where you started to shift your mindset in your story about seeing color. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I mean, if I just simply look at the past few years personally and the events, as a society that we've all been exposed to, I found that I was proudly colorblind. I was raised to not think or treat people differently based off of the color of their skin. I mean, the color of their eyes, the color of their hair, any of that, right? Everybody was equal. What I didn't realize, and I didn't really give enough thought to, was that's really not the point. Society brings with it a history. And if we don't face and change by being color aware, then we won't actively evolve what the history is that we're creating. So that simple shift has really expanded my thought to much more of being color aware and how I look at the world, how I look at my friends and family around me, and how I look at the work environment and what people bring to the table with diverse thought.
Just spend a little bit more time on what color aware means to you, so that maybe others and who think that way can, get some advice on how to think more deeply about being color aware.
Yeah, when I think of color aware versus colorblind, I think about people bring something to the table based off of their background. In some instances, sure, the color of their skin brings with it a culture, brings with it a history, brings with it, who they are as a person, what shaped them as a child. Understanding how they're viewed from society and the history that society brought with it is the only way we're ever going to get to truly including people and including that diverse thought into, the teams that we build, the history that we set for ourselves moving forward. So it's not that we're just simply looking at everybody being equal, but it's actually understanding what made them who they are, the society that we all live in, the biases we all bring with us as well.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for that more deeper thinking. Jerry, as Jeff mentioned, we bring our histories with us. And I think that's one of the challenges we've had in diversity, equity, inclusion, is that we try and pretend that, oh, because you work here, we're all equal. And that is just outright not true. And so stories become really complicated, even for those who are sharing them. And unfortunately, history repeats itself if we do not resolve it or face it. And Jerry, as an Asian American, we all know what's going on today in not just those cultures, but in all people of color. And we don't have enough time to explore any of those things today because we're talking about inclusion. But Jerry, you have a story around how you were impacted as an Asian American, and that has impacted your mindset and how you lead today. Can you talk about that experience growing up?
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to do that. And, certainly the concepts of invisibility that both Sharra and Jeff spoke of are going to be included here as well. It's not an easy story for me to tell, but I believe it's an important one to hear. So growing up in and around New York City, I never would have expected to be met with racist violence. But when I was about 16 years old, a group of my Sunday school friends, we were all Asian American, specifically Thai American. We were all taking a break from Sunday school activities and wanted to pick up some food. There's a Taco Bell real close, so we decided to walk there. And along the way, a group of white kids drive by and start yelling out racial slurs. And so, we're a group of teenagers. We respond by, cursing them out. And we kind of like, after we get done cursing them out, we turn around and kind of expected it to all be over and we'll just kind of move on. Instead, they roll up and come at us with bats and pipes and hammers. I got hit in the head. I got cracked in the head by one of those guys. Managed to, keep my wits about me and ran off. Eventually made it to the Taco Bell, and the folks there saw that I was all bloodied up. So they called the police, they called an ambulance. Thankfully, I didn't need stitches or anything like that. I recovered fine from my physical wounds. The police, spoke to us, to me and my friends, and they met with our parents. They told us that they'd take care of it, right? But nothing ever came out of it. So nowadays, right, this generation would have tried to make that go viral. But back then, our parents were just like, don't cause a fuss. Let's just brush it off. Let's move on. And the problem with this approach is that it made us invisible, right? A very unfortunate event, and in my mind, a very unfortunate outcome as well. But it did teach me a couple of things. And it taught me that despite this being the 90s, I thought things were pretty progressive. Being in the New York City area, somehow racism was still real, right? It taught me that. And the other thing that it taught me was that in order to make a change, you have to step up. You have to speak up. Your community has to step up for you, and your allies have to step up because ultimately victims need their voices to be heard. And with what's going on now, it's important to hear those voices and stories like mine.
Oh, Jerry, my goodness, thank you for sharing such a traumatic story. I mean, I know how painful that must have been for you, and even in retelling the story today. So thank you for sharing. And Ashley, you have some experience at seeing the Asian community experience through someone else's eyes, maybe not as traumatic as Jerry's, but how did your experience with your roommate impact how you began to shift your mindset around diversity?
Yeah, I think it's important for us to hear, like, as coming from a privileged background, it's important to hear how bias and racism affects the people we work with and like our friends and family on a day-to-day basis. And just understanding that makes it all the more real and understand how it affects us systematically. So my roommate in college was actually Asian American as well. Both of her parents immigrated to the US from China, went to graduate school here, and then she was raised in Philadelphia, New York City area. So completely different background from me. We had completely different perspectives, a lot of different things. So it was really great to get to know her, and we're still really close friends. But Some of the things that were really important to her, so when she was joining organizations or clubs, were things that I didn't have to think about. So when she would go to class or decide to join a new club, she would be really concerned that there weren't any other Asian Americans or any diverse people represented in the organization. And it was something that I realized that I never really had to think about. Like, I was always represented in a club or something that I wanted to do. So getting to know her and getting to see how frustrating it was when people asked her where she was really from, after saying she was from Philly, or people assuming that she was an international student, just those kind of things that are really demoralizing, that made me realize that I needed to think about diversity in a different way than I had previously before.
Yeah, and that concept of, again, always having to defend yourself, right? And stand up for yourself and explain yourself is a theme. And then it combined with isolation makes it really tough, I think, for organizations and people within those organizations to feel included, unless they're amazing like our panelists, where they're doing their work and understanding their story so that they can become allies and support people towards moving and feeling more included. I want to ask the audience if you know that according to the Society for the Human Resource Management organization, that companies with a strong diversity and inclusion lens improve their market share by 46%. And 70% are more likely to capture new markets. So we're not just talking about, you know, a sad song here or a sad story. We're talking about real impact, not only things that will change people's lives, but also that will change the lives of organizations and will benefit organizations if we can get this inclusion piece right. I think we're beyond diversity, which is getting representation in the companies, and we still have more work to do there. But if we are losing people as fast as we are bringing them on, then we are not making progress at all. So to that point, Jeff, talk about your personal story and why this inclusion is so important for you as you raise your children.
Yeah, I mean, two different stories here. I mean, the first one, it's a pretty simple one. It's inclusion really from the other way around. And a friend of mine and I had been out fishing. We brought our fish back to that family up the street where Mark lived, the black family up the street. And we were just showing off our catch, cleaning our fish in his driveway. His grandmother comes out just completely disgusted. She's looking at the butchery job that we're doing. She takes us into her kitchen, teaches us how to clean the fish, teaches us how to pan fry the fish. And I thought back on it and I'm like, you know, this is a woman who grew up in Alabama at pretty hard times. She has absolutely no reason to share with us any of her learnings. But because we've gained a relationship with her son, she included us. She brought us into her house. I remember years later sitting at her funeral when one of her family members were talking, and they said, Grandma would always leave all of the doors to her drawers, her kitchen cabinets open. And then one time they asked her, they said, Grandma, why do you always leave all your doors open and don't close up behind you? And she simply said, I never know what I might need. And that really stuck with me. If we could just keep the doors of our minds open, because we never know what we might need, that diverse thought, the way of thinking beyond what we do as individuals. Further in life, you know, years passed, and my wife and I were blessed to adopt 2 children of color from different backgrounds, different cultures, different countries. You know, we kept our minds open, and that's exactly what we needed at the time, a family. And as a parent, seeing the life through their eyes gives me a whole new perspective. Another interesting story or example is we were down at the beach, we were having lunch, and we were sitting at this restaurant that happened to be owned by a senator. So one of our state senators. He comes over, he's doing his politics around the table, and he looks around at my family and, you know, just gets this puzzled look. I mean, 2 white parents, 2 kids of color. And he points over at my son and he goes, what's he?
Wow.
Now, as the dad, I was about to fire off a boy, what's he look like? You know, something that was not going to provide any help at all. My wife calmly takes my hand, remembers, you know, what we had learned through our home study programs, through adoption, and just looks at him and says, I think what you meant to say was, where was he born? Guatemala. Well, as a senator, he immediately knew what he had done wrong. You know, he backpedals, he tries to actually make excuses, you know, everything else. But it was one of those time periods where I realized as a parent, I was going to have to learn things completely differently. They didn't see my children the same way they saw me. We weren't coming from the same level of privilege. So it just changed my mechanism moving forward to how to look at the world differently and make sure that as a parent, I could understand what they were going to go through.
So Jeff, I'm curious, and the audience may want to know, when you all made the decision, only if you're willing to share, when you made the decision to adopt children of color, did you think about some of the challenges that you might have?
Oh, absolutely. And I'd love to share. So you have to shut me up. I love to talk about my kids, teenagers now. So a little bit different time period. But the first child we adopted from Guatemala, we specifically were looking for someone that, you know, needed a home. We didn't care what people looked like. I already told you about, you know, my diverse friends and family. That made no difference to us. But we knew some of the challenges we would have bringing somebody home from Guatemala and growing up. So when that adoption was about to fall through and home study programs or the paperwork is only good for 2 years, we reached out to Florida and we specifically asked for a biracial child because we didn't want one child to look like us and one child not to look like us. We wanted them to have that in common. So that has served us well. They've joined us in many programs with their schools where we talk openly about adoption. They talk about the differences that they see, but we certainly went into it eyes wide open.
That's really profound. And thank you for sharing that, Jeff. You know, Sharra, you have a similar experiences to Jeff. In some contrast to, in your story, you talk about interracial dynamics and intersectionality and how that's impacted you. Can you share with us your background and experience here?
Yeah, sure. I have to say that in addition to my parents doing just such a wonderful job of rooting me and who I am, and later that rooting really taking place and going to a HBCU, a historically Black college, were just such wonderful decisions, a decision for me. That experience at home and going to that historically Black college helped me to thrive and grow and explore in an environment where for once I did not have to carry the burden of questioning if my race was a factor in any of my interactions. It was so freeing for me. And this experience further rooted me and grounded me in my Blackness and was wonderful. And so I think about interracial relationships, and they're not always straightforward. People show up with their biases, with their stereotypes. And that acute experience as a teenager was such a pivotal point for me. I was faced with a situation where my peers effortlessly were willing to degrade me in front of me. And this helped me to understand just how deep and pervasive stereotyping and racism is, even though I really thought that I knew it all up until that point. So my experiences in high school didn't stop. So in the workplace, the theme of invisibility has been pervasive. I can't tell you the number of times I've been called another Black woman's name. One time that stands out for me is when a man who I didn't work with closely called me another woman's name, a Black woman, and he worked closely with that other Black woman. So it's the realization in these moments that not only was I invisible, not an individual, not being seen as an individual, but one of a collective, but she was invisible because he actually had a relationship with her. And this type of thing is just so unconscionable to me. So dealing with those kinds of things when it comes to interracial relationships can get tricky. And this whole experience of being invisible happens to me, but I know it happens to other people as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that in diversity research, it talks about groups, sort of in groups. So the groups that you feel included, and so that therefore you're more comfortable being with them. And that's human nature. And I think attending an HBCU, particularly in the grounding of feeling like, to your point, you don't have to defend yourself. And to Ashley's point, watching her Asian friend, well, you don't have to question whether or not you're included because of your, or not included because of your race or gender. Those are all really important things. And I think, Jerry, like Sharra, your story includes this concept of being invisible also, but this sort of acknowledgement that in the workplace, even some people who you think are allies or who can help you get ahead, they actually may be experiencing sort of diversity issues or being impacted by not being included themselves. Can you share a time, Jerry, when you talked about as you were growing up as a leader and what happened to you?
Yeah, so in a previous role, I was met with some barriers to learning and to growth in my career because the person who, it was a person I looked up to, I wanted to emulate. That person didn't take the time to want to help me learn and grow, for some reason or other, right? I can't speculate as to why, but what I did was, I kind of brushed it off, right? Like typical me, typical of what my parents will want me to do, and just try to move on, believing that that's just kind of how things worked. And it really wasn't until my allies stood up for me, and this is long before I even knew what the concept of allies were. So my allies stood up for me, and in particular, a female leader in the organization took it upon herself to guide me towards growth opportunities, because she saw that I was striving to learn more and trying to grow in the organization, but I was facing a lot of adversity and being met with folks who were stunting my growth. And I believe that because she was a female leader, she probably faced similar adversity, right? And so she took what she learned, imparted that onto me to help me grow. And now I seek to become an ally, right? Just like her and just like the other allies who had my back.
That's so important, and learning as we go, because the important part of this journey, Ashley, that you talk about is that, we get to change our story. We can be in the environment, we can be whatever kind of leader that we want. We can have whatever biases that we have. And most of the time we don't realize the biases that we have, but we get to choose whether or not we want to go on the journey to understand, change, and grow from that realization. So Ashley, you specifically, represent that as a child, you were told what to do and what to think for the most part, but we get to learn from our environment as adults, and we get to choose and change our thinking. How have you changed your thinking?
Yeah, I think getting to know my roommate and other friends that she had in the Asian American community just made me realize that a lot of the things that I had thought about diversity inclusion were not correct. Like, I think I thought that bias was perpetuated by like individual people who just maybe weren't like up to the times, but in reality, it's really a systematic issue that will only be fixed by more aggressive corporate and institutional policies. So having those conversations with my roommate and with other friends just made me realize that the things that I believed, like politically and in terms of those corporate policies, like we were interviewing at the time and looking at different jobs, and I wasn't really thinking about diversity and inclusion, but if other people are being held back or not included, then that will also trickle down to me as a woman in an organization. So it was something that became really important to me and isn't really important to me now, now that I'm an adult and I'm working full time. It's diversity and inclusion is something that I really value in the corporation that I work at.
That's really important, Ashley. Thank you for that. And as we've been going on this journey, we realized as we were processing that each story has a theme. You know, storytelling is so powerful in that it builds community, it builds a togetherness, it allows leaders to expand the way that they relate to their teams, and also it creates team cohesion. And then it brings together all of the great things that diversity does, like creativity and innovation. And so in our story theme, you know, usually in any good story, the protagonist goes on a journey and they're learning something. They, you know, kind of have experiences that they share, but then they come back and they realize, oh my God, this is what was happening to me all along on this journey. And so at the end of our journey, there was a theme that each one of you identified in your story. And Sharra, your theme was being rooted in yourself while not being seen, or by not being seen or invisible. So share what your learning has been now, understanding sort of the theme of your story.
Yeah, so it's so many things, and it's going back, and I think I've referenced my family multiple times, my community, and the deep levels of support I've received, and through my college community and beyond, and how they've helped me build a strong foundation because they understand the challenges that I would face. And you know, they prepared me, lifted me up. This is a part of the rooting and the building of the foundation. Other Black people along the way who I've met, and even people who I've never met. You know, one of my favorite poems by Maya Angelou is Still I Rise. And I've shared some tough experiences here today. And thank goodness I have so many more wonderfully elevating and positive experiences that fill up other parts of who I am. I think these stories are important to share, though, because people are just not one-dimensional. When you hear the hard stories is when you get to flex those empathy muscles. You don't get your empathy workout when you just look at sort of the facade of people's stories and believe that they're going through just one thing, the positive things.
Right.
And at work, we typically get to experience the positive side that they bring with them, because that's what they present. And that means that people are not showing up as their full selves. And all of these experiences that I had, the way I was loved, the way I was nurtured and supported, has really shaped how I lead. I understand that people don't show up to work as a blank slate, just ready to work. And in order for me to understand how to be inclusive, which I use as a verb, by the way, because to be inclusive is an intentional set of actions. It's a practice. And in order for us to understand how to be inclusive, or what might feel inclusive for others, we need to understand people and who they are.
Yes, Sharra, thank you. That is so profound. And you're right that we're not one-dimensional. We have our personal mythology and our stories that shape the way that we see things and the way that we behave. And unfortunately, even something that we may think is positive for us may actually be a negative impact on someone else. And that's why it is important to know your diversity's journey and story. Jerry, your theme was seeing a different perspective within and outside of my group. Share your learning through this journey about inclusion.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I grew up in a relatively insular community, and I learned at a young age that in such an insular group, right, you can get caught up in groupthink, and the only way out is to immerse yourself into a more diverse community, to surround yourself with more diverse thinkers. I was lucky, right? I could just step out the door and become immersed in diversity. Others have to make an effort to understand what it's like to be different. So, you know, because of this, I encourage my teams to listen to ideas from all teammates, right? Not just the most vocal teammates. Everyone is worthy of having their ideas included.
For sure. And Jeff, your theme was diverse family friends and seeing the world through their eyes. Explain again how that has impacted your approach to inclusion as you lead your organization or your department.
Yeah, as we've discussed, today, I've been blessed with a diverse group of family and friends, but I've also been able to, travel the world and experience different cultures, et cetera. And, in my experience, and quite frankly, everything that I've read about the subject, a team that is built of diverse thinkers always creates a better result. Initially, there might be a little bit more conflict because they don't all see things from the same way. So you're going to have some battles up front, but that's where the catalyst of true creativity comes from. That's where you see the true innovation. When we run our design thinking programs with external partners and customers, we intentionally bring people from different empathy maps, from different backgrounds. It's the way that you force creativity to happen because you're making sure that everybody's open and not just going the easy way and picking people that think like them. So to me, that's something that we can all take on board, and we know it produces better results.
You mentioned forced creativity. It would be great if we didn't have to force it, right? Where we could just come together and have it happen, because creativity in itself is so powerful. And it's unfortunate when it has to be forced. But I think that that is something that as we do design thinking, as we build policies, as we start to change things, understanding who's at the table and making sure that table is represented and by people who have different ways of thinking will have an outcome. And I think that we focus so much on race. And the idea is that we can have 10 Black people and they all think differently. We can have 10 white women and they all think differently. So expanding our idea of what diversity is also important, so that we can get away from these superficial biases and realize that at the end of the day, we're all human beings. So finally, Ashley, your story thing was understanding my values in the DE&I, starting from little exposure growing up.
Yeah, I would just
Mhm.
echo what I have said before. I think it was something that I hadn't really thought about, and then meeting more people in undergrad really forced me to think about and take stock of what I valued. And it was a little bit uncomfortable at first, but I think I'm glad that I put in the time to be reflective and to think about how my values matched up with who I wanted to be and what was important to me in my career and in my personal life as well.
So Ashley, you were breaking up a little bit, but can you say a little bit, you mentioned about being uncomfortable. So I think it would be important for people to understand, because really at the edge of your comfort zone is where you are going to have a transformation. So what was uncomfortable, and what would you say to people about pushing through even when you're uncomfortable?
Yeah, I think when I say I was uncomfortable, I think it had a lot to do with like the political conversations that I was having with my friends at the time, and just things that were happening in the world like 2 or 3 years ago, and just our different opinions on that. And we didn't always match up. So it's kind of weird to be in a disagreement with your friend and think, well, maybe I'm not in the right here. Maybe I need to do more research on this to understand like what's happening. And so I think being like humble and really reflective is really important in those situations.
That's really true. And Ashley, as we begin to wrap up, I want to stay with you for a minute, because you represent, and I almost want to apologize on behalf of some of my peers, because you represent Generation Z, and you represent the generation that we're going to be leaving this world to and these organizations to. And so, there's a lot of work to do. And I think we're all committed to continuing to do the work while we're here, but you're going to inherit what we do and what we don't do. So as we wrap up, can you share what you see as key values in an organization that you think will help others feel included? And what does leadership need to do? And what would you say to your generation?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think to leadership, or one of the key values for being in an inclusive organization, I think would be trust and authenticity. So I think speaking to leadership, and in that perspective, it's really important to make sure that historically unrepresented populations or minorities have opportunities to be doing stretch projects, or that they can be heard during meetings, and that everyone's ideas are taken seriously, and that we all feel like we can be ourselves and express ourselves at work. I think that's really important, and it boils down to leadership trusting their teammates or team members, and allowing them the chance to do their work and be themselves. And then I think the piece about my generation, I actually think we have an opportunity, because this generation and this time is so much more inclusive than the generations before. So now, like, my experience at IBM, I'm only 6 months into my career, but my experience so far has been really positive, and I feel like my leadership is open to feedback, and that IBM is very committed to diversity and inclusion, and that's something that's really important to me. And I think my generation has an opportunity to say, I only want to work at companies that are committed to this, and that's something I would agree with. So we have that option of being like, we're only going to work somewhere that is committed to this. So I think that's an opportunity, even in the midst of all of the things that are going on in this time.
Yeah, Ashley, thank you for that. And in the research, it does bear out that people are leaving companies who are not inclusive. And I want to applaud or people who do this, because we all have to step up and raise our voices, and we have to stand up for people. All of us on this stage today, and within the sound of my voice, we're all privileged in that we're here in this conversation. So we have some privilege just in that fact. And I think it's our responsibility, along with the Generation Z and everyone, to stand up for others who aren't as fortunate as we are. So thank you for that, Ashley. So Jerry, obviously you have a journey and a story that you've gone through around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as you reflect on your story, what's your advice on how to increase inclusion when you speak to the leadership community, and also something that's really important to you, first generation Asians?
Yeah, first of all, shout out to Generation Z and the group that Ashley is a part of, right? Because I spoke to Ashley, prior to this, and Gen Z, when they see something, they say something, and I really admire that, and I wish my generation had done more of that. So yeah, I'd like to start speak directly to first generation Asians, really all children of immigrants. I feel like our parents preferred for us to be somewhat silent, right? Don't be a burden to anyone. Just go about your business. So it's hard for some of us to tell our stories. But my advice is that we need to speak up. We need to tell our stories. We need to speak up on behalf of other persons of color. And we need to step up too. We need to step up, become an ally, step up and take and ask for prominent roles in your organizations, because we need broader representation in our organizations. And if I could speak to the leadership community, be an ally, right? Show solidarity, and pay particular attention to outside events that are affecting our community. And I'll get back to why that's important a little bit later. So if you have folks on your teams who are moved enough to tell personal stories, and that's great, you're lucky that you get to hear from them. But for those on your teams who feel more comfortable being silent, let the events that are shaping our world be the personal stories for those who are silent and putting on a brave face. And they're simply putting on a brave face. Acknowledge their experience and be there to support them.
Wow. Thank you for that, Jerry. So profound. And in the same vein, Sharra, you have talked about existing in multiple worlds of intersections. And how can leaders, what messages do you have around how leaders can support inclusion for those who are in different worlds of intersectionality? And also, who would you speak to? What message would you give to either women of color or Black women in that vein?
Yeah, so I'll speak to the leadership community first. I feel very fortunate to be able to focus primarily on inclusion, diversity, and equity at Rocket Software. We have such an amazing foundation. Our core values are empathy, humanity, trust, and love, which is just amazing. And we take these values seriously. And these values really support my own philosophy and practice when it comes to leadership. We as leaders must be brave enough to lead with empathy and to understand that people have varied experiences which are integrated into who we are as people and inform how we make decisions, which trickles down into the unique ways in which we are contributing to the business. And some of these experiences that are happening right in front of our faces at work, some of these awful experiences that people are having. And some of us are carrying the load of repeated microaggressions, oppression, and pushing through all of that and still performing. So in order for us to build true inclusive environments, we need to understand the lived experiences of people so that we know who we're building these inclusive environments for and what it looks like.
Right.
We can't build inclusive environments based on a guess or a prototype. We need to lead with empathy, listen to people, see them, hear them, and you want to, I think ultimately we all want to see deeply engaged employees. And for me, that seems so simple.
Right.
Just see their humanity and then act accordingly. And so for other Black women, for women, people of color, find your people, find your community, those folks who are going to support you no matter what, that you can be in a room with someone, with this group of people, and you don't have to explain every little detail because they get you, they know who you are. These are the people who are going to patch you up and send you back out, and who are also going to tell you the truth and help you to stretch, right? And then I would say, go beyond that group. Once you have that solid foundation, go beyond that group. Build allies, build relationship, create new friends across the organization, and have a real growth mindset, and not only will you benefit from this, in seeking out mentors, and I always believe in having older and younger mentors. Having these mentors who can support you, but it's not only for your benefit. In those reach outs, in building those relationships, you also give other people the opportunity to know you and not just you as a member of a particular social group.
Thank you so much, Sharra. And as we're coming to a close, Jeff, I'm going to give you 1 minute, if you could, to speak about the privilege that you have, and what would you say to leadership and those who are privileged?
Yeah, I think individually and personally, we all have to educate ourselves. We have to learn more about diversity and inclusion, and we have to see life through other people's eyes. We can't simply, gather groups that are like us. As corporations, we need to be more intentional in building teams of diverse thought, to be more inclusive. But the key to me is to listen more and speak less. We know it drives better results. And as leaders, I think it was said earlier, it's time we all need to be comfortable being less comfortable. We need to be uncomfortable, get into these conversations. It's the only way we'll progress and evolve as a society.
Absolutely. And thank you, Jeff, for coming in at the minute time frame. And unfortunately, everyone, we are running out of time and we are going to have to end the conversation. But obviously, this is a complex but necessary conversation that we have to continue. And we hope that you've been moved and inspired in some way by the stories that our brave panelists, Jeff, Jerry, Sharra, and Ashley have shared with you. And I just really want to thank you all for being so open and honest with your stories today. On behalf of our sponsor companies, Rocket Software, IBM, Broadcom Mainframe Software, Virtual Z, Tech Channels, and Open Mainframe Project, we thank you for joining us today. And remember that we want to challenge biases that we see in each other. That is the first step to real inclusivity, by unlocking the potential of people and therefore our teams and companies so that we can be better. We can be better by doing better. And we want to continue this collaborative initiative by learning more. We want to learn more about each of you who are listening to us today. And so we want to know, what does DE&I mean to you? What is your company doing to further DE&I efforts? And do you have experiences starting, planning, or running a DE&I program or initiative? Reach out to Tech Channel Senior Editor, Kalia Estrada Moeller at kmoeller@techchannel.com to share your insights and to be on the lookout for a social campaign that will be coming to further this dialogue. So we will see you next time at our next event. We have more stories to share from other diverse perspectives. And again, we so appreciate you joining us today. Thank you and have a wonderful day.